And now for the other stories of this hour. France says the European Union has the tools to hit back at the United States after President Donald Trump imposed fresh 10% tariff on all imports. France's Trade Minister Nicolas Frossier says the bloc must stay united and be ready to retaliate if needed. He says Brussels has the right instruments at its disposal and can no longer afford to be naive. Options include the EU's so-called anti-coercion instrument, known as the trade Bazooka, which could target US tech firms, restrict exports, impose tariffs on services, or block US companies from public contracts. A suspended package of tariff on more than 90 billion euros of US goods could also be reactivated. Meanwhile, Italy's central bank governor Fabio Panetta says US tariffs have added just over half a percentage point to inflation, now at 2.4%. India, South Korea and Indonesia are saying that they are reviewing the implications as global trade tensions rise. We are now going to Raymond Vickery, who is an international affairs expert, former US Assistant Secretary of Commerce, joining us from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us here today on NewsX World. What are the potential economic and diplomatic consequences if the EU actually deploys tools such as anti-coercion instruments or retaliation tariffs in response to new US global tariffs for both the EU and its transatlantic relationship with the US?
Well, thanks very much for having me. It's certainly true that in order to wage peace like you wage war, you have to have a strategy, you have to have partners, and you have to have principles. And a chief part of that strategy has to be economic engagement. Economic engagement and security are joined at the hip. They're part of the same reality. So what is happening now in regard to France, in regard to EU, is an attempt to work around the chaotic approach of President Trump and his administration to the economic component of waging peace. The EU has been between a rock and a hard place. They did succumb to a 15% agreement in terms of tariffs. But now that's all thrown into a cocked hat, if you will, because of the United States Supreme Court ruling, which indicates that the authority that was used by the president is absolutely not applicable to the situation. So Macron and France, EU by extension, have gained some incentive to look again at the ways in which to work around the United States. Unfortunately, that workaround is not a simple matter because of the size of the U.S. economy, the long-term relationships between EU and the United States. It is hopeful that saner heads on both sides will be able to work through this difficulty because it has extremely serious implications, as I said, not only economically, but in security terms. People talk about China as the rising power and India economically. But it must be remembered that EU has an economy which is really greater than that of China. So the implications are very serious. President Trump got elected on his pledge to defeat inflation. That is not happening. But others in the world are looking for alternative ways to move on.
And how should the EU balance its desire to defend its economic interests, for example, agriculture, luxury goods, aerospace, with the broader need to keep stable political and security cooperation with the United States?
Well, that is, of course, the multi-billion-dollar question, the existential question. It is the case that the U.S. and EU have such strong ties over such a period of time, and that the relationship is important not just to EU, US, but to the entire world. India has recently reached a trade agreement with the EU. EU is negotiating with others as we speak. I think that the way forward is to try to prevent a disruption of ties. President Trump will not be on the scene. The chaotic approach which he has engendered, which really is sui generis. It's really not a part of U.S. history for the last 100 years or so. After World War II, the United States embarked upon a freer trade, rule of law approach. So President Trump will not be on the scene all the time. The United States Constitution is beginning to kick in. The checks and balances of the judiciary against that of the executive, the legislature will take new heart from midterm elections. So the way forward is to try to prevent a disruption of ties and to maintain relationships until President Trump is reined in and eventually passes from the scene.
Thank you, Raymond Vickery, but please don't go too far, as we will be joining back with you very soon. We are now going to Namal Abraham, who is a financial analyst, joining us from Kerala in India. Thank you for joining us here on NewsX World. To what extent can mechanisms like the anti-coercion instrument, sometimes called the EU's trade bazooka, realistically deter economic coercion from powerful partners like the US, and what risks could arise from its first use against an ally?
Well, I think it was expected. I mean, ever since Trump spoke about Greenland, and he had already tried to impose 10% tariffs on 8 European Union nations, in fact, 7 European Union nations and the UK in early Jan. So we had expected such moves. But the bright side, as the previous panelists mentioned, the world has adjusted, not just the European Union. If you look at India, where I'm from, the world has adjusted and have made adaptations so that in the future, they don't have to rely on the US. So, for instance, in the US, due to the US tariffs, we lost close to $5.5 billion US of exports. And so what did we do as a nation? We tried to find an alternative market, which we never really had to in the last few decades. So we realized that the European Union was a market with a higher population, a similar spending capacity. So we tied hands with the European Union and the UK while the tariffs were running. So I think these kind of actions were expected from the EU. Now that the tariffs are cut down by the Supreme Court, I believe India has now the room to revisit and renegotiate on the deal as well.
And like we heard, given that other trading partners like India and South Korea are also reassessing their positions amid US tariff shifts, how might these dynamics reshape global trade alliances and influence the EU's trade policy going forward?
I think it's a good time for the European Union to project themselves as an alternative to the US. Because if you look at other markets, other large markets, one is Russia, and most people are not associating with Russia because of sanctions. The other is China, and most countries are not associating with China because of how ambiguous their actions are. And so I think as now for countries like India as well as Asian countries, associating with the European Union is a safer option, a more reliable option, and a more profitable option because they have a higher population than the US. And as I mentioned before, almost near similar taste and economic spending capability, at least in some other countries. So I think that is going to benefit the EU, and now that and also because of what the US did. I mean, the last 8-9 months, because of the tariff actions that Trump took on several nations, including India, nations have now started to negotiate with new countries and try to bring in trade alliances with new countries, and that is going to affect the stance of the US as a global trading partner, and also the amount of dependency that smaller Asian nations have on the US have also come down thanks to Trump's tariffs.
Thank you so much, Namal, for joining us here on NewsX World. It was a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you.